Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
I've been working at this retail store for about 3 years now, and I've seen my fair share of entitled behavior, but nothing quite compares to my co-worker, who I'll call Karen. She's been with the company for 15 years, and somehow managed to turn that seniority into a free pass to do absolutely nothing. The managers were always walking on eggshells around her, because she had a reputation for threatening lawsuits over the smallest things. Every time they tried to make her do her fair share of work, she'd throw such a massive tantrum that they'd eventually back down. It was infuriating for the rest of us, who actually had to pick up her slack. One day, Karen came waltzing in with a new excuse to avoid work. She complained about having a terrible ankle sprain from home and insisted she needed to sit while working. When the store manager asked if she had a doctor's note, she whined that she didn't but argued that they couldn't possibly expect her to stand all day. The manager, being the pushover they usually were, gave her a folding chair to sit on between customers. We started calling it her throne behind her back because she acted like such royalty. The chair was too low to actually use while running the register, so she still had to stand up for customers, but somehow that didn't seem to bother her injured ankle. This meant she could no longer help with truck day restocking or changing out the sales tags, two of the most time-consuming tasks we all shared. Instead, she'd just sit there all day, reading romance novels and snacking while the rest of us ran ourselves ragged. This went on for about 2.5 weeks. Then came the day that changed everything. Karen's husband was late picking her up after her shift. After waiting for maybe 15 minutes, she suddenly stood up, gathered her things, and put away her precious throne. As she headed for the door, she casually told us to inform her husband that she was walking to McDonald's because she was starving. Mind you, McDonald's was 3 blocks away. Apparently, her ankle injury was selective about when it bothered her. 20 minutes later, her husband came in looking confused and asked about his wife's whereabouts. The store manager wasn't sure and asked if anyone knew. I told him that she had decided to walk to McDonald's because she was hungry and wanted him to pick her up there. As soon as Karen's husband left, they stormed into the office with her throne, locked it away, and announced that we were done playing this game. The next day was absolute chaos. Karen came in expecting her throne, but instead, she got called into the manager's office. We could hear her screaming from outside. She was yelling about her 15 years of service and how they couldn't do this to her. The manager fired back that if she was well enough to walk 3 blocks to McDonald's, she was well enough to do her job standing up like everyone else. Karen threatened to sue the company, but the manager put her on a 90-day probation, warning her that one more stunt would get her fired. She called in sick for the rest of the week, probably thinking they'd cave like usual. But this time was different. The manager called her with an ultimatum. Either show up for her next shift with a doctor's note for her absence, or she'd be fired. He reminded her about her probation status too. Miraculously, she showed up for her next shift completely healed. But the manager wasn't done. They assigned her to closing shifts with me because they knew I wouldn't let her slack off. When I told her she needed to restock the shelves before closing, she tried to say she'd leave when her husband arrived. I told her that was fine, but only if all her work was done, and I was happy to stay all night if needed since I wasn't the one on probation. For the first time in probably years, she actually did her job. 2 weeks later, she quit. Apparently, having to work like everyone else was too much for her to handle. The funny thing is, after she left, our store ran so much smoother. No more drama, no more picking up her slack, and no more thrones. I wonder if she found another place to pull her act, but at least it wasn't our problem anymore. I've always been a cautious person, and after spending 4 years in the military, that trait only intensified. When my husband and I finally settled down in our new neighborhood, we decided to get a German Shepherd dog for security. We made a conscious decision not to socialize him with people outside our family. It might sound harsh to some, but we needed him to be a guard dog, not a friendly neighborhood pet. Our dog turned out to be exceptional at his job, maybe too good. A group of teenage boys in the neighborhood started making it their weekend hobby to rile him up, trying to see if they could provoke him into jumping the fence. But our dog is incredibly well trained. He never leaves the property unless I'm with him. He won't even follow my husband out the gate or try to escape when we're moving cars in and out of the driveway. The only time he leaves the property is when I check the mail, and even then, he stays pressed against my body the entire time. This training paid off during an incident with my stepbrothers shortly after we moved here. They'd been warned that he was aggressive with strangers when my husband or I weren't around to introduce them, but they ignored the warning and approached him while he was sleeping in my mom's yard. Let's just say they learned their lesson about respecting warnings. Today, though, things escalated to a whole new level. I was checking the mail with my dog as usual. Thankfully, my 18-month-old daughter was napping instead of being out there with us. Suddenly, these dirt bikes came tearing down the road. One of the riders, sporting this huge grin, deliberately swerved into my driveway, nearly hitting me. My dog reacted instantly. I'd only seen him this aggressive once before. Every hair on his body stood on end, teeth bared, ready to attack. If I hadn't already grabbed his collar when I heard the bikes coming, he might have pulled me over. The kid on the bike turned around and started yelling, calling me a psycho witch and complaining that my mutt had almost bitten him. My dog might be well trained, but I'm not one to hold my tongue, especially when someone threatens my safety. I shot back at him, pointing out that he had almost hit me on my own property. I reminded him that he and his friends had been taunting my dog every weekend since we arrived and warned him that if I ever caught them near my fence again, I'd report them to the sheriff for animal cruelty and provoking an attack. That's when the kid threatened to poison my dog with antifreeze that night. I dropped the collar immediately. The kid was lucky my dog is trained to stay by my side because he went ballistic, barking, growling, and snapping, but never moving away from me. His friends scattered, but this kid stood his ground. I called the sheriff's department and explained the situation. As soon as I gave them my address, I heard a woman's voice in the background telling the dispatcher to have me put the call on speaker. It turned out to be the kid's mother. I put the call on speaker, and this kid went white as a sheet while his mother tore into him. Apparently, this wasn't his first offense. He had a history of taunting animals and a record of other incidents too. The kid skulked home like he'd been physically beaten, while I finally got my mail with my still agitated dog at my side. 2 hours later, a sheriff's car pulled into my driveway and honked. It was the mother. She gave me her personal number and told me that if I ever had any more problems with the local teens, I should call her directly. She promised to contact their parents and make sure they learned how to behave properly in society. A week later, I was surprised to see the same kid walking up to my fence, this time on foot and during broad daylight. My dog immediately went on alert, but the kid stayed a respectful distance away. He called out to me, and I could tell by his demeanor that something had changed. He awkwardly apologized for his behavior and explained that his mother had not only grounded him for a month, but had also made him volunteer at the local animal shelter every weekend. He admitted that working with the shelter dogs had opened his eyes to how wrong his actions had been. What really got me was when he mentioned that he'd been learning about military service dogs during his shelter work, and he now understood why my dog was so protective. He asked if there was any way he could make it up to us. After discussing it with my husband, we agreed to let him help us repair some damaged sections of our fence, damage that he and his friends had caused during their weekend hobby. Over the next few weekends, he showed up reliably to help with the fence work. My dog still kept a watchful eye on him, but the hostility was gone. The kid even started warning other teenagers in the neighborhood to stay away from our property, becoming an unexpected ally in keeping our home secure. The mother called me again about a month later, this time to thank me for giving her son a chance to make things right. She explained that she'd been struggling with his behavior for years, and somehow this incident had been the wake-up call he needed. She also shared that his volunteer work at the animal shelter had turned into a regular weekend job. Since then, it's been surprisingly peaceful. Amazing what can happen when you get the right authority figure involved, especially when that authority figure turns out to be the neighborhood troublemaker's mom. Even more amazing is watching someone turn their life around when given the chance to understand the impact of their actions. My guard dog still does his job perfectly, but now he has one less threat to worry about, and I have one less parent to call. I've been working at this local bar and grill for about 3 years now. Started as a server, worked my way up to bartender, and I love my job, most days. The pay is decent, my co-workers are great, and our management team actually stands up for us, which is pretty rare in this industry. Especially our general manager who's been in the business for over 2 decades and doesn't take any nonsense from entitled customers. Last week during a busy Friday evening shift, my co-worker, another bartender, was handling the bar section while I covered the dining room. That's when these three guys walked in, all wearing matching green polo shirts with their lawn care company's logo and phone number printed on the back. They seemed okay at first, just your typical after-work crowd looking for some burgers and beers. My co-worker took their order and everything was going smoothly until one of them decided to complicate things. The guy told my co-worker that he wanted to add bacon and pulled pork to his burger. My co-worker apologized and asked if he'd prefer the toppings on the side or a completely new burger. The guy said he wanted a new burger but planned to eat the current one too. My co-worker explained that he'd need to pay for both burgers in that case, and the guy agreed that it was fine. My co-worker put in the new order and everything seemed settled. The guy ate his first burger while waiting for the second one with the toppings he wanted. When it came time to close out their tab, my co-worker processed the payment using the card the guy had left on file, which he had explicitly given permission to do. That's when things went south. The guy exploded, demanding to know why he was being charged for 2 burgers. My co-worker reminded him about requesting the second burger with bacon and pulled pork, and how he'd agreed to pay for both since he'd eaten the first one. The guy then angrily declared that he didn't want the second burger anymore and demanded a refund. He was causing such a scene that our bar manager came over to handle the situation. Being the peacekeeper that they are, the bar manager voided the payment and generated a new check with just the burger he ate. The guy slapped some cash on the bar and stormed out ahead of his friends, thinking he was so clever. Except he was $5 short on his tab. My co-worker, being the nice person they are, offered to cover the difference just to be done with the whole thing. That's when our general manager, who had been watching the entire situation unfold, stepped in. They refused to let my co-worker pay for the customer's shortcoming. The general manager picked up the phone and right there in front of the guy's 2 friends who were still finishing their drinks, called the number on the back of their uniform shirts. Our general manager professionally explained to their boss that one of his employees had just deliberately shorted his tab by $5 after causing a scene about a burger he ordered, and wanted to make him aware of how his company was being represented. We could hear their boss's frustrated response through the phone, calling his employee a jerk. Not even 5 minutes later, the guy came rushing back in, red-faced and fuming. He slammed a $5 bill on the bar and left without saying a word. His 2 friends were still there, looking absolutely mortified. They profusely apologized for their co-workers' behavior, left a generous tip, and walked out shaking their heads. Our general manager just smiled and went back to work like nothing happened. I later found out that this wasn't the first time they'd called someone's workplace about bad behavior. They explained their philosophy. If you're going to wear your company's uniform while acting like a jerk, you better be prepared for consequences. I've been working in universities for most of my adult life, but there's one story that really stands out from my early days. Back in the 1980s, I was working as a staff assistant in one of the major departments at a prestigious university. I had worked my way up through various positions over the years, and at this point, I was supervising 4 secretaries while managing other responsibilities. The department was huge. We had 18 professors, each generating mountains of paperwork. This was before computers became commonplace, so everything had to be typed on typewriters. I'm talking about massive documents, 30-page resumes, research papers, clinical reports, class materials for over 25 courses each quarter. Making corrections wasn't as simple as hitting the backspace key. You had to carefully realign the paper and type over the mistakes without messing up the rest of the document. It was a skill that took years to master. We had recently hired a new secretary. I'll call her Secretary J. She had good test scores during the interview process and seemed to have decent experience on paper. Like all new hires, she was put on a 6-month probation period. I assigned her 4 professors to work with, which was standard for new secretaries. 3 months into her probation, it became painfully obvious that Secretary J was completely incompetent. Despite constant training and supervision, she couldn't handle even the basic tasks. I found myself not only checking her work but completely redoing it from scratch. Her assigned professors had basically refused to let her touch any of their documents anymore, though they still felt sorry for her. Apparently, they didn't feel sorry enough for me, since I was now doing all her work while she just sat there answering phones. The situation came to a head when we finally decided to terminate her employment. We gave her a 2-week notice, which was more than generous given her performance. But then something infuriating happened. One of her assigned professors, let's call him Dr. A, suddenly had a change of heart. This was the same professor who had been the loudest voice complaining about her incompetence. Dr. A argued that we should give her another chance, saying she was such a nice person. I responded that being nice didn't make up for not being able to do the job. He insisted that everyone deserves a second chance and said he would talk to the department chair about extending her probation. Without consulting me, the person actually dealing with the consequences, Dr. A convinced the department chair to extend Secretary J's notice to 4 weeks. I was absolutely furious. This was the last straw. The next morning I made a decision. I walked straight into Dr. A's office. I told him that starting that day, all of Secretary J's work for him would be handled directly by her, and I wouldn't be checking or correcting anything. He tried to protest, saying it wasn't necessary and that we could work something out. I refused, telling him that since he wanted to give her another chance, he would work with her directly. I explained that all document discussions, proofreading, and corrections would be his responsibility. By noon that same day, Dr. A was practically begging me to reconsider. He pleaded for my help, telling me she had just submitted a research paper with 17 typos on the first page alone. When I reminded him that he thought she deserved another chance, he admitted he had made a mistake and hadn't realized how bad it was. I pointed out that he knew exactly how bad it was. He just didn't care because it wasn't affecting him directly. I stood my ground and went straight to the department chair, making it crystal clear that if he didn't back me up this time, he'd be looking for a new staff assistant. The chair, finally understanding the situation, supported my decision. For the next 2 weeks, Dr. A suffered through countless typing errors, missed deadlines, and poorly formatted documents. The other professors watched this unfold and suddenly became much more appreciative of my role in the department. They realized that just because someone was nice didn't mean they were qualified for the job. Secretary J's employment ended as planned, and I continued working with Dr. A for another decade. Surprisingly, this incident actually brought us closer together. He gained a new respect for my position and judgment, and over the years, he became my favorite professor and a father figure to me. The day Secretary J left, Dr. A came to my office with a cup of coffee. He admitted he had been wrong and thanked me for teaching him that lesson. I simply welcomed his acknowledgement and suggested we get back to work. And we did, with a much better understanding of each other's roles and responsibilities. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.